This video is a continuation of the personal pronouns video, and this one focuses specifically on who and whom. If you remember from the previous video and our previous lessons in class, the personal pronouns can function in 5 roles, any way that a noun can: subject, predicate, noun, in any of the objective roles like object of preposition, direct object, or indirect object. Who and whom are just 2 of those pronouns, and if you look at the chart below, you'll see that we have who and whoever functioning in the subjective, so they can be the subject or predicate noun, and we have whom and whomever functioning in that objective role, and they can be the object of preposition, direct object, and indirect object. Whose is the adjective form, the possessive form of who and whom. If you pay attention to what the pronoun is doing in the clause and in the sentence, you will make fewer mistakes in your use of the words who and whom. So who is the subjective form of the pronoun? It can be the subject or the predicate noun of a sentence. If we look at the sentences we have here, we see Sheldon is a physicist who knows his science. We have a couple things going on. We have 2 clauses. First of all, we have the clause that says Sheldon is a physicist, and then we have a second clause that says that somebody, namely Sheldon, knows his science. And so we have to look at them separately before we can determine whom. Sheldon is a physicist is the independent clause. We're going to ignore that and then look at what's left here. We have a verb, knows. Who's doing the knowing? Who. And so we know that who is actually our subject in the sentence. So we need to use the subjective form of whom, which is in fact who. The second sentence, the winner is who. We have a question, but it's actually set up like a normal statement, so we can just go with what we have there. We have is as our linking verb. Winner is the subject. Who is actually renaming winner, and so that is a predicate noun. Because it's a predicate noun, we know that it needs to be the subjective form of the pronoun whom. The third example, who gave Ms. Martinson the new Titleist driver, is a question, but again, it's formed in the order that a normal statement would be ordered. So, who gave Ms. Martinson the new Titleist driver? Gave is our verb. Who is doing the giving? Who, so that's our subject, and then we have driver and Ms. Martinson being the direct and indirect objects respectively. So again, it's in the normal order, so we can just leave it as it is. And the last sentence, whoever it was, thank you, we have it was whoever. If we reword it into a statement, and this is the one that tends to trip people up. Because we have a linking verb here, we must use the subjective form in the predicate noun. So it must be whoever, sorry for the mess there, rather than whomever. Whom is the objective form of the pronoun, and whom can be the object of preposition, the direct object, or the indirect object in a sentence. And the easiest way to figure out what it's doing in the sentence is again to mark up those sentences. So if we look at our first sentence, to whom should these lovely roses be delivered? We could reword it if we wanted to, but because we mark prepositional phrases first, we can see immediately that we need to have whom because it is the object of the preposition. The second sentence, whom was the spitball flicked at? This one's a little different. It's a question starting with whom, and it might be helpful if it's not immediately obvious to rework that sentence and reorder it to make a statement. So whom was the spitball flicked at becomes the spitball was flicked at whom. So we have spitball was flicked, and here we have a prepositional phrase with the preposition away from the object of preposition. And that can happen in questions, and that's why it's always a good idea to go ahead and rework that question, make it a statement, so that you know what that whom is working with. The third sentence, whomever can you blame for the ruckus in the hall? This one I'm going to mark up again for the ruckus in the hall, and that allows me to get rid of a few things in the sentence so it's not so confusing. I'm going to reword it into a statement. You can blame, sorry for the bad writing, whomever. Now we have a statement, and now if we look at this one, we can see that you is the subject, can blame is the verb phrase, and whomever has become our direct object. And so it's not the subject here, even though it's in the subject place, it's not really the subject. And in order to be sure of that, you do need to take the time to reword it. Not necessarily on paper, but for sure in your head. You want to reword that question and make it into a sentence so that you can figure out the correct answer. And then finally, the last sentence, our arch rival, whom we beat, was undefeated until today. And here we have again the two clauses, so we have to pay attention. Our arch rival, whom we beat, was undefeated until today. We have beat, we have was, and we have to find the nouns that go with those two verbs. So if we look at a sentence like this gets a little confusing, but if we look at a sentence like this, and we see that we have a noun right to start, and that noun is next to our who, whom, it's likely that we have a split clause. And that's what these white lines I've written in here represent. And that split clause is done because the whom we beat is giving us more information about the subject of that sentence, about the rival. It's called an adjective clause. And it helps with wording. It allows you a little latitude in the way you want to frame your sentences. But for our purposes, we need to understand that the rival was undefeated until today is the main clause of this sentence, and whom we beat is a subordinate clause supporting the information on that outer sentence. This is a little confusing language-wise, but if you just look at it logically, I think it will make a little more sense. So we have the first half of the sentence, our arch rival was undefeated until today, and then we can ignore that when we're figuring out the who, whom, and just look at that inner part, whom we beat. Beat is the verb. Who's doing the beating? We are doing the beating. We beat, action verb, whom, and again we have a direct object here. So take the time to look at the sentence, think about what you're seeing before you make a final decision about whether you should use who or whom. One last thing to remember about who and whom is that when the pronoun begins a subordinate clause, and I showed you that on the last example, the use is determined by the clause that it begins. It is not affected by the independent clause. And really all that means is what I was doing in the last sentence, which is that we're going to find the independent clause. In this particular sentence, my cat, who's very fat and crabby, woke me up this morning. The independent clause is on the outside. My cat woke me. And I can ignore it because it says it is not affected by the independent clause. So I'm going to get rid of the independent clause, and I'm going to look only at that dependent clause. And if I just break that down like I know how to do, I have is as a linking verb. What's doing this? What's in the state of being? It is who. So who is functioning as our subject in that sentence. In the next sentence, much the same thing. Mr. Erickson, who is our principal, is very well liked. Mr. Erickson is very well liked is the independent clause, and I can ignore it because when I'm trying to figure out whether to use who or whom, the use is not affected by that independent clause. So again, is, linking verb, principal, predicate, noun. We're missing a subject, so who is the correct choice there? In the third sentence, the person who ate my cookies will be sorry. Same format, but we don't have the commas, so we have to think a little bit more. The person will be sorry is our independent clause, and then ate is our verb. The person or thing doing the eating is who, so again we have a subject, and cookies direct object. The last sentence gets a little bit different. My friend whom you can trust will help you escape. My friend will help you escape is that independent clause on the outside that we're going to ignore, and then we're going to look at the inner clause. Can trust is our verb. Who's doing the trusting? You. So you is the subject of this clause. You can trust whom. So there we have a direct object. And again, when you look at these sentences and you're looking at the nouns next to the who whom, if you have a noun followed by a who whom, you'd likely have a split clause. And so it's nice to think about what this is doing before you break down the inside part. Whose is simply the possessive form of the pronoun who. It functions as an adjective in a sentence. And the most important thing to remember about whose is that it is different from who dot or who apostrophe s, which is a contraction of who is. This is really just a carelessness error. If you ever make it, you know that whose is the possessive form and who apostrophe s is who is. So just don't be careless and make that mistake. Lastly, I'm going to do a few sentences, just walk through them as I process. First one, I know who the culprit is. I see two verbs here. I have know and I have is. And if I look at this sentence, I see I know, so I have a subject and verb right there. That's an initial clause. I can get rid of it. And then I can go on to my work with the dependent clause, which is who the culprit is. The culprit is the person, place, or thing in that state of being, so there's my subject. And who is functioning as the predicate noun here. You can reverse it. You could call this the subject and this the predicate noun if you wanted to. It doesn't particularly matter. The most important thing is that you know that you need to use the subjective form who in this example, in this sentence. Second sentence, can you tell us whom they really want? You can tell us. We have another verb there, can tell, and want is a second verb. If I look at the sentence, I have an entire clause before the whom clause. You can tell us is a complete idea with a subject, verb, and direct object, so I can ignore it and move on to my dependent clause. Want is the verb of that clause. Who's doing the wanting? They. They want whom is our direct object here. We need to use the objective form. Sentence number 3, we accept contributions from all whom will give. I can look at this again. I see a couple of clauses because I see more than one verb. There are my two verb phrases, accept and will give. If I look at the first accept, we accept contributions from all. Is that a complete idea? Absolutely it is. I can ignore it and move on to my dependent clause. Will give, the person, place, or thing doing the giving is who. So I need to use the subjective form here because it's the subject of that clause. The next sentence, whom were you writing to? Who were you writing to? We have a question here, so if I'm not certain, I want to rewrite it into a statement form. You were writing to blank. And if I look at this, I can figure out pretty quickly that this is a prepositional phrase. Because it's a prepositional phrase, I need the object of a preposition. The objective form is whom, and my work here is done with this one, so I know that it needs to be whom as the OP. The next sentence, the player whom won was awarded the trophy. I have player next to the whom, so I have a split clause here likely. And so what I need to do is figure out what that player, the verb that goes with the word player, and in this case it's the player was awarded the trophy. I'm going to ignore that clause and focus on the dependent clause. And it's really pretty simple here. I only have two words. I have one as the verb. I only have one other option. I need a subject for that clause, so the answer has to be who. And finally, the last sentence. The students whom the teacher helped did well on the test. Sorry, it's cut off a little bit there, but we can work through it. And we have the students whom right next to it. So we have that noun, pronoun next to one another. That is a clue for us that we have a split clause. So the students did well on the test is going to be ignored, and then we're going to focus on that dependent clause in the middle. Whom the teacher helped. Helped is our verb. Who's doing the helping? The teacher. That's the subject. Teacher helped whom. We have a direct object. So you notice as I'm going through these that I'm actually doing things a little bit backwards from how we learned it in September. I'm looking for the verb and then finding out who is attached to that verb. Who's attached to the action that that verb is doing. And that helps me figure out which pronoun I need to use, whether or not it's who or whom. That's everything for who and whom. And the one thing you need to remember is what is that pronoun doing in the sentence? Is it being a subject or predicate noun, or is it being some sort of object? And that will help you make the right decision when you use it in your writing.